I have been writing for about 17 years, since 2008. And this one is a book of short stories.
Michael Harris sold more than 40 million children's books across the world, becoming one of the most beloved entertainers in Britain. Parents trusted him, children adored him, and for nearly 2 decades his face was a constant on family television. He was seen as a man who brought joy wherever he went, the kind of figure who could make a nation smile with just a story. But in 2021, one leaked private recording changed everything. The conversation shocked audiences, ruined his reputation, and forced him to step away from the career he had built. What nobody realized at the time was that this was only the surface of Michael's real story. The cruel words caught on tape were not the darkest thing about him. Behind the stage lights, behind the laughter, there was a truth far more painful. It was a truth about secrets he had been carrying since childhood, about multiple suicide attempts, about family struggles, and about a sadness so deep that he would spend his entire life trying to survive it. Michael Harris's life wasn't just about fame. It was about endurance, about a boy who grew into a man still haunted by the same shadows. Michael Harris was born on September 4th, 1973, in Birmingham, England. His parents, Peter and Anne, worked tirelessly just to make ends meet. His father was a city bus driver who earned around $7,500 a year. His mother was a part-time nurse at the local hospital, sometimes pulling night shifts for an extra $40 a week. They lived in a cramped 2-bedroom council flat on the edge of the city, its windows looking out at the depot where his father parked the buses. To an outsider, the Harris family was ordinary, working class, unremarkable, doing the best they could. But inside that small flat, Michael was different. From the age of 4, he would disappear into the cupboard under the stairs for hours at a time, practicing voices and imitating the characters he heard on the radio. His mother once recalled how she'd find him in the kitchen, talking in 5 different accents, carrying on full conversations with imaginary people. What no one could see then was that these performances weren't just games. They were his escape. Even before he turned 7, Michael was already wrestling with anxiety, loneliness, and the first dark thoughts that would stay with him for the rest of his life. When Michael was 9 years old, he joined a local youth drama club. It should have been the perfect place for a boy who loved voices, costumes, and comedy. For a short while it was. He lit up on stage, memorizing lines in a single night, delivering them with a natural flair that impressed the adults. But the other boys didn't see talent. They saw someone to mock. Within weeks, he was being ridiculed for sounding too posh and too dramatic. They nicknamed him Actress and shoved him into lockers. One boy slapped him across the face during rehearsal and told him to act like a man. The bullying followed him home, and for the first time, Michael began to wonder if there was something wrong with him. The breaking point came during a winter school trip to Snowdonia. Michael was sharing a bunkhouse with older boys who teased him relentlessly. One evening, after hours of jeering, Michael was found dangling from a rope tied to the upper bunk. He had looped it around his neck. A teacher cut him down, and the official story given to his parents was that it had been an accident, a prank that had gone wrong. His mother never believed it. Years later, Michael himself would admit what really happened. He had tried to end his life. He was only 9 years old. The incident was buried quickly, but for Michael, it marked the beginning of a secret battle that would shape his entire life. He returned home quieter, more withdrawn, locking himself in his room for hours. He filled notebooks with jokes and sketches, trying desperately to drown out the darker thoughts. His parents didn't speak of what happened. They accepted the school's version of events, telling themselves it had been nothing more than a mistake. But Michael knew the truth. He didn't want to live anymore. He didn't know how to explain it, even to himself. All he knew was that the pain inside him was bigger than anything he could put into words. By age 10, Michael had developed an obsession with comedy. He would scour charity shops for records and tapes, spending his entire 2-weekly allowance on secondhand albums. He built a collection of more than 60 comedy records, memorizing every word of Monty Python sketches, Rowan Atkinson routines, and stand-up acts from comedians far older than him. He would stay up late into the night, rehearsing full shows in front of the mirror, often dressed in his sister's old clothes, adding wigs and scarves to become someone else. His mother once woke at 2 in the morning to find him performing a full sketch in the living room, pretending an invisible audience was laughing with him. What no one outside the family knew was that Michael was already under medical care. At just 11 years old, doctors prescribed him a low-dose antidepressant, imipramine, a drug rarely given to children at the time. His parents were told it might help stabilize his moods. Michael began wearing headphones almost constantly, blasting music for hours just to silence the thoughts in his mind. He would lie on his bed staring at the ceiling, convinced that nobody really understood him. His schoolwork began to suffer. Within 6 months, his grades collapsed, dropping from A's to D's. Teachers wrote in their reports that he was bright but distracted, a boy who seemed to live in another world. Michael himself later admitted that laughter became his lifeline. Every sketch, every funny voice, every moment he could make someone smile, it was all part of holding himself together. But the truth was, he was falling apart. He was still a child, but already he was carrying the kind of pain most adults never fully understand. When Michael entered secondary school, things quickly spiraled out of control. On his very first week, he was mocked in the lunch hall for the way he spoke. His accent wasn't rough enough. His mannerisms were too dramatic. His walk was different. Within days, he became the target of relentless bullying. The older boys saw his love for theater and comedy as weakness, and they attacked him for it. By the end of his first term, Michael had already been hospitalized twice. Once after a group of boys shoved him into a wall so hard he fractured his wrist, and another time after being locked in a dark supply closet for more than 6 hours. When a janitor finally found him, he was shaking, dehydrated, and covered in bruises. The bullying wasn't just physical, it was psychological. His classmates began calling him Mime, because he often performed silent sketches in drama class, and the nickname stuck like a scar. Wherever he went, he heard whispers, laughter, cruel voices telling him he didn't belong. His weight dropped rapidly. Over the course of a single year, he went from 9 stone to under 7, his face becoming hollow, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. Teachers noticed the changes, but no one intervened. His English teacher quietly kept notes about his condition, the fading bruises on his arms, the strange explanations he gave for his injuries. When asked about the black eye he carried into class one morning, Michael insisted he had fallen down the stairs. Nobody pushed further. At home, Michael tried to hide the truth from his parents. He told them he was fine, that school was going well, but at night he was crumbling. He filled pages of his journals with sketches, punchlines, and jokes, trying desperately to use comedy as a shield against the loneliness that consumed him. Laughter had become his survival tool, and every night he retreated into that world just to make it through the next day. The worst moment came in the autumn of 1986, when Michael was 12 years old. The bullies dragged him into the boys' toilets and forced him to perform comedy sketches while they pelted him with wet toilet paper. They laughed as he tried to act out Monty Python routines, humiliating him in front of half the school. That same evening, he walked home in silence, went straight to his bedroom, and swallowed a handful of pills he had taken from his mother's medicine cabinet. He collapsed on the floor just after 7:30 p.m. It was his sister who found him, unconscious, his lips turning pale. The ambulance arrived at 8:12. For 3 minutes, Michael's heart stopped beating. Paramedics managed to revive him, and he was rushed to hospital, where he remained under psychiatric observation for 72 hours. The doctors wrote in their notes that Michael's thoughts were unusually severe for a child of his age. He wasn't just sad, they said. He was desperate. He didn't want to be alive. That truth shook his parents to the core, but even then, they struggled to understand it. They pulled him out of the youth drama club, thinking the environment had triggered his breakdown. But it wasn't the club. It was everything. The bullying, the isolation, the sense that no matter where he went, he didn't belong. For Michael, the attempt was a secret he carried in silence for decades. He didn't speak about it publicly until years later, long after he had become famous. But at 12 years old, he was already living on the edge of despair. After the suicide attempt, Michael withdrew even further into comedy. It was the only thing that seemed to keep him alive. By 13, He had memorized dozens of sketches and could perform entire one-man shows in front of his mirror. He would stay up late, rehearsing routines, transforming into different characters, telling himself that if he could make people laugh, maybe they would stop seeing him as weak. Comedy became both his shield and his mask. But even in those moments of joy, he couldn't escape the darkness. Teachers noticed his grades slipping further. He went from being one of the brightest students in his class to barely passing assignments. At home, his parents argued over what to do. His father, a practical man, insisted he simply needed to toughen up. His mother, more sensitive, worried that her son was slipping into a place she couldn't reach. Michael, meanwhile, felt like he was living two lives, one where he smiled and performed, and another where he battled thoughts so heavy that he could barely breathe. The summer of 1987 brought another devastating blow. Michael had been convinced to attend a summer scout camp, a last attempt to help him fit in with other boys his age. At first he tried. He went along with the games, the hikes, the nightly campfires, but the teasing returned almost instantly. The older boys mocked his voice, called him names, and during a fake swimming test, stripped him down and left him humiliated in front of everyone. That night, Michael went back to his tent, tied his school tie around his neck, and tried once again to end his life. This time, his mother found him. She had driven to the camp unexpectedly, worried after days of not hearing from him. When she walked into the tent, Michael was unconscious. The camp erupted in panic. The ambulance arrived just before 8 p.m. Doctors said he had been without oxygen for several minutes. For 3 days, he remained under strict watch, doctors documenting that his condition was worsening. He was only 12, yet his medical notes read like those of an adult battling severe depression. After that, his parents finally pulled him out of the Scouts for good. But the damage was done. Michael was scarred, physically by the bullying, emotionally by the humiliation, and mentally by the darkness that never seemed to leave. The doctors advised ongoing psychiatric care, but in the 1980s, mental health was rarely spoken about. His parents hoped things would get better with time. Michael knew otherwise. Deep down, he understood that this wasn't something that would fade. It was something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even so, he continued to hide behind comedy. He continued to perform sketches in front of the mirror, to memorize records, to drown himself in laughter. It wasn't because he wanted to be a star. It was because laughter was the only thing keeping him alive. By the time Michael turned 14, his parents hoped he might finally find a place where he belonged. That year, he was accepted into a prestigious youth theater program in London, the same institution that had launched the careers of some of Britain's most celebrated actors. For a boy who had memorized comedy albums and spent years performing alone in his bedroom, it should have been a dream come true. But in reality, it was yet another reminder of how deeply out of place he felt. Surrounded by other teenagers who loved acting, Michael should have felt at home. Instead, he felt more isolated than ever. The other students formed quick friendships, laughing together between rehearsals, meeting up after class. Michael lingered on the edges, smiling when spoken to, but always retreating back into himself. Years later, he admitted that it felt like everyone else had a group. Everyone except him. Even in a room full of kids who shared his passion, he was still the outsider. It was during these years that he first crossed paths with another young performer who would later become one of his closest collaborators. Their friendship began as a simple partnership, two awkward teenagers making each other laugh. But even then, Michael's sadness never fully lifted. He described it later as wearing a mask. On the outside, he played the role of the funny friend, the one who could make everyone laugh. On the inside, he was falling apart. At school, his academic life continued to unravel. He had once been a top student, praised for his sharp memory and wit. But by 16, his report cards were filled with notes about distraction, lack of focus, and sudden mood swings. His teachers recognized his talent in drama, but in every other subject he was slipping further behind. The only place he excelled was on stage. In one memorable exam, he scored 98% for a one-man performance piece about loneliness. Ironically, it was the truest expression of his life at the time. As he edged closer to adulthood, Michael began to understand that he couldn't keep living in two worlds. He was the boy mocked, bullied, and broken in private, but he was also beginning to shape the identity of a performer. He needed something that would separate those two lives. That moment came at 17, when he applied to join the Actors' Equity Union. He discovered, to his frustration, that another performer had already registered under the name Michael Harris. If he wanted to act professionally, he would have to choose a new name. For most people, it might have been a minor inconvenience. For Michael, it became a turning point. Sitting at the kitchen table with a phone book in front of him, he ran his finger down a list of surnames and stopped on one at random. That was it. He would no longer be Michael Harris. He would be someone else entirely. His father was furious. He saw it as an insult to the family, as if Michael were rejecting their name and everything it represented. He confronted him, telling him that Harris was their bloodline, their history, and that throwing it away was a betrayal. But for Michael, it was never about fame or professionalism. It was about escape. It was about leaving behind the boy who had been mocked, who had tried to end his life more than once, who never felt good enough. Choosing a new name was like choosing a new skin. It was the chance to stop being himself, if only for a little while. But a new name didn't solve his old battles. As he stepped into adulthood, the shadows inside him grew darker. By 1989, Michael was accepted to study drama at the University of Manchester. For the first time, he was living away from home, surrounded by other aspiring actors and artists. It should have been liberating, and in some ways it was. He threw himself into performances, winning praise from his lecturers, making audiences laugh in student productions. Yet behind the curtain, he was still the same boy, tormented by depression, plagued by thoughts he couldn't silence. The winter of his first year at university was one of the darkest periods of his life. As Christmas approached, Michael returned home to Birmingham. Friends celebrated the holidays with family dinners and laughter, but Michael locked himself in his childhood bedroom. The walls still carried posters of comedians he had admired as a boy, but now they felt like silent witnesses to a lifetime of sadness. One evening, he overdosed on pills, collapsing on the very floor where he had once rehearsed his childhood sketches. His family found him in time. He was rushed to hospital, his life saved once again by quick intervention. To the outside world, nothing had happened. His parents told relatives he had simply been unwell, another case of exhaustion. But Michael knew the truth. He was 19 years old, and this was his third serious attempt to leave the world behind. For Michael, that winter marked the beginning of a pattern that would follow him for years. On stage, in classrooms, and later in television studios, he wore the mask of a confident entertainer. But behind closed doors, he was battling something relentless. He didn't know how to name it then. He only knew that it was always there, waiting for him in the quiet moments. By the time he returned to university after the holidays, he had made a silent decision. If he couldn't escape the darkness, he would at least outsmart it. He would bury himself in work, in performance, in laughter. He would keep making people smile, because if others were happy, maybe, just maybe, he could convince himself to be happy too. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't that simple. The sadness wasn't going away. It was just waiting for its next chance to consume him. When Michael returned to university for his second year, he was determined to transform his pain into something useful. He threw himself into sketch writing, improv, and stand-up, often performing late into the night for small audiences of students and locals who couldn't get enough of his sharp wit and unpredictable energy. On stage, he was magnetic. People described him as larger than life, capable of turning even the dullest moment into a spectacle. What they didn't see was the exhaustion he carried back to his dorm after every performance, collapsing into bed as if the laughter of strangers had drained every last ounce of his strength. It wasn't long before talent scouts began to take notice. By the early 1990s, Michael was performing at festivals and small television spots, earning a reputation as a comic voice unlike any other. He had the rhythm of a seasoned stand-up, the timing of a natural-born storyteller, and the eccentricity that made him stand out in a sea of hopefuls. For a young man who had spent most of his life feeling invisible, it was intoxicating to suddenly be seen. But with recognition came pressure, and pressure often brought the darkness back to the surface. Still, His career climbed steadily. By his late 20s, Michael was not just performing, he was writing and starring in sketch shows, bringing his bizarre characters and clever satire to television audiences across the UK. Viewers adored him. Critics hailed him as one of the most original comic voices of his generation. For the first time in his life, he seemed to have everything he had dreamed of: a platform, an audience, and the respect of his peers. But while the public saw a rising star behind the scenes, Michael was unraveling. It was during this time that a private tape, never meant to be seen by the world, leaked into the public sphere. The details of the tape were intensely personal, deeply intimate, and devastatingly embarrassing. Overnight, the media pounced. Tabloid headlines mocked him. Journalists speculated cruelly about his private life, and fans who once adored him now viewed him through the distorted lens of scandal. For Michael, it was a nightmare. The boy who had once been mocked in classrooms was now being ridiculed on a national scale. Every insecurity he had buried resurfaced, louder than ever. The media storm wasn't just humiliating, it was re-traumatizing. He had built his adult identity on the idea that he could escape the pain of his childhood by becoming someone new, but the scandal dragged him back to a place he thought he had left behind. Friends recall that during this period, Michael became withdrawn. He avoided phone calls, canceled appearances, and locked himself away in his home for days at a time. The mask he had worn so successfully for years began to crack. But even in the midst of this crisis, he never stopped performing entirely. In fact, some of his best-reviewed work came during this era. It was as if he doubled down on comedy, using humor as both a shield and a weapon against the relentless shame that followed him. Years later, when asked about that period, Michael admitted that the scandal had nearly destroyed him. But he also said it forced him to confront something he had been avoiding for most of his life: the reality that no amount of fame, success, or applause could silence the voice inside him that told him he wasn't good enough. It was a painful revelation, but also a turning point. From then on, he began to speak more openly, at least with friends, about the depression that haunted him. He didn't always use the word depression. Sometimes he called it his black cloud or his shadow, but those close to him understood what he meant. Despite his inner turmoil, Michael continued to grow as a performer. His style matured, his writing became sharper, and he built a loyal following of fans who admired his willingness to be strange, vulnerable, and unpredictable. But behind the curtain, his struggles never went away. He described his life as a constant tug-of-war between the version of himself the public adored and the version he battled in private. By his mid-30s, he had become a household name, appearing in films, television shows, and live tours. He had the career he had once only imagined in his bedroom as a lonely child. But those who knew him best say the cost was enormous. He pushed himself to exhaustion, worked through depressive episodes without pause, and often joked that if he ever stopped performing, he might not survive. His comedy wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. The scandal that once threatened to end his career faded over time, replaced by new projects and new successes. But for Michael, the damage was lasting. He carried the shame with him long after the headlines stopped. In interviews, he would deflect with humor, changing the subject with a quick joke, but those who looked closely could see the pain flicker across his face. The world laughed with him, but very few understood the weight he carried, and perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of Michael's story. He spent his life making others laugh while secretly fighting a battle that nearly took everything from him. To the outside world, he was a brilliant comedian, a quick-witted performer, a national treasure. To himself, he was still the boy sitting alone in his room, wondering if he was worth anything at all. As Michael moved into the later years of his career, he would eventually become more candid about his struggles, using his platform to talk, however cautiously, about mental health, shame, and resilience. But at the core of his story was always the same heartbreaking truth. Behind the name, behind the fame, and behind the laughter was a man who never fully escaped the darkness that had haunted him since childhood.